Hello, and welcome to Keep the Channel Open. My name is Mike Sakasagawa, and this is episode 9. This week I'm presenting a conversation I had with San Diego artist TML Dunn. I had a really good talk with him a couple of weeks ago at his studio here in San Diego. So we will get to that in just a few minutes. First, I wanted to have just a little talk about some stuff I've been thinking about related to community and representation. So for the past 3-4 years, I'm not quite sure exactly how long, but for the last little bit, off and on, I've been loosely working on a documentary project, photographic project, about the neighborhood that I live in. And the neighborhood I live in is kind of an interesting place because there are a lot of different kinds of people that live here. Sort of economically diverse, racially diverse. Recently, this became the first neighborhood in San Diego that is majority Asian, which is something that I find really interesting about it. But it's also a neighborhood that has had sort of a bad reputation in some ways. Not for being dangerous, but just for being kind of low class in some ways. It's a reputation that is, depending on who you ask, either completely unfair or completely earned. And the photographs that I've taken around this neighborhood of the people, the houses, the sort of the life around this neighborhood, I'm trying to sort of see how well I can represent both sides of that. But one of the things that I've been thinking about has to do with the fact that I'm very aware of the fact that there are people who live in this neighborhood who definitely would take a certain amount of umbrage with, for example, if I were to ever present this project publicly and include pictures of an overgrown yard or a car up on blocks, they would see that as being playing to the stereotypes about this neighborhood and would take umbrage with that. And rightfully so, because in a lot of ways, the reputation of this neighborhood, many of the people who live here and own homes here would like to see it progress. It has been changing somewhat in the time that I've lived here, about 10 years. But, there's certainly the argument that could be made and has been made that the bad reputation has kept away certain types of businesses, which could, help make the place nicer. There's obviously a large conversation all around the country about gentrification and about how that affects residents. But here in the neighborhood that I live in, which is called Mira Mesa, it's not really, we don't, at least the conversation as far as I'm aware, doesn't seem to be revolving around gentrification as a negative thing. But this idea of who gets to decide how you represent a community is something that I've been thinking about a lot lately and haven't really come to any conclusions. I know last summer I saw a big blow up around a photographer named Chris Arnaud and his photographs documenting homeless and addicted people and prostitutes around the Hunts Point neighborhood of the Bronx in New York. Also, in the past year or two, there's been a lot of controversy in Photoland around a photographer named Stacy Kranitz and her work in Appalachia. And in both of those cases, I will include links in the show notes to their work, so you can certainly look them up on your own if you care to. In both of those cases, there's been an interesting dialogue at times, perhaps not necessarily a dialogue as shouting matches, but it's been interesting because many of the people who live in the communities in which they are working, communities that they are not actually a part of, have taken issue with the way that those photographers are representing those communities as, again, engaging in stereotypes in ways that are damaging to the communities. And, those photographers turn around and fire back saying, you know, we're not showing anything that isn't there, and for you to say that I can't show these things, these people's lives that I'm showing, you want to erase these lives and not show them, that's also damaging. I think it's an interesting conversation, and one that I haven't fully settled for myself where I come down on it, because I think that there's actually a lot of legitimacy to both points of view. I think that stereotypes and othering of your subjects can be damaging to communities. I also think that erasure of the most marginalized members of a community can also be damaging. So, you know, where I fall on that, I don't really know yet, but it is something that I wonder a lot, you know, how much leeway, how much permission, access do I have in representing the community that I live in? How much does it matter that this is where I live and have lived for quite some time now? But I wasn't born here. I didn't grow up here. I am, on some levels, still an outsider. But I live here. I send my kids to school here, to the public school, and so I am in some ways part of the community. And so, you know, getting to know how much I get to decide and how much I need to listen to other people in deciding what aspects of this community to represent in my photographs is something, it's a tricky situation to be in, to want to have a desire of showing all sides of an issue without wanting to do it poorly, without doing it in a way that hurts people. Anyway, it's a topic that, like I say, I haven't fully resolved for myself, but it's been on my mind a bit the last couple of years, and certainly if you have any thoughts on the matter, I'd love to hear them. So, you know, you can send me an email, podcast@keepthechanneleopen.com. Anyway, on to today's episode. As I mentioned, this week I'm presenting a conversation with San Diego artist TML Dunn. He goes by Matt in person, but you can look him up as TML Dunn. I met Matt at an opening at the San Diego State University Downtown Gallery a few weeks ago. I went to go see an opening of a show, an SDSU show there called Made in Form, and it was a very eclectic show. It was really cool. If you got a chance to see it, you know what I'm talking about. But, you know, his work really just grabbed my attention immediately. What he had done was he had crafted a small figurine out of some kind of plastic or rubber that was made in his own image, maybe about 5-6 inches high, and put it under a bell jar and then shined a strobe light on it in a way that combined with a vibration in the stand that the little doll was hanging off of, made it look like the hands and feet and the head a little bit were sort of writhing in a very lifelike and disturbing, unsettling way. It really grabbed me, and I kind of knew this is a guy I know I want to talk to. And he very graciously agreed to be on the show and invited me to visit his studio and check it out. And I had a really great time visiting with him. So you'll hear, we discussed in several of his pieces during the conversation, and I'll just point out in the show notes there are links to a few examples that we specifically talked about on his website, which I've linked, tmldunn.com. Under the drawing section, there's one called Selfs, which is a series of several months worth of weekly self-portraits. There's one called Pains on the same page, which is hammered text on paper. It was very interesting. We talked about that towards the end of the conversation. There's another one that we loosely talked about a little bit, called Untitled, and then JT in parentheses. And then on the painting page, one that we spent a fair amount of time talking about is another untitled one, which in parentheses is called Anti-Analogy. So you should definitely go to his website, check out his work, and because it's really pretty amazing stuff. And so without further ado, I guess, here's my conversation with Matt Dunn. Well, anyway, I really appreciate you having me here.
Of course.
It's I don't get a lot of opportunities to really see the spaces that people work in. That's something that doing this show has really been a great opportunity for me to see so many different types of practice that people have.
Yeah.
And it's really been pretty eye-opening. People work in a lot of different ways. And actually, it seems like I could kind of say that about you just by yourself, that you work in a lot of different ways.
This is the cleanest you'll ever see this space. I just moved in. Yeah.
Yeah, but I mean, just looking around. So, and you were showing me this just before we started. That I mean, the range of different kinds of things that you have going on here, going from painting to photography to sculptural things, but even some of the sculptural elements are not what you'd think of as traditionally sculpture, incorporating motion and strobe lights. I don't know that many people who do this much different kind of thing, and it's a little it's almost a little intimidating. But so one of the things that we were talking about before, that it seems like you have a real interest in experimenting with different mm-hmm. approaches, like not necessarily settling in on just one type of thing, and I find that really interesting. That when people can that experimentation is really often a form of exploration, and really it seems to me like that's one of the fundamental things about making art, that making art is itself an exploration.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So I mean, is that sort of...
Yeah. No, I mean, like I said, I think I like to think of art as knowledge production, mm-hmm. and I think it's also politically important to think of it that way. But I mean, it's the most interesting to me when I'm working on a question I don't know the answer to. I mean, it's experimentation, absolutely. Mm-hmm. The piece you saw at the SDSU Downtown Gallery with the figure, the timeline on that was so tight that I figured, no pun intended, I thought it would work, but I didn't plug the figure into the device uh-huh. and get everything going until the day before I was dropping it off.
You made that piece for that show?
For a show previous, but it was that timeline for that show in November was very tight. Uh-huh. I did that one and that one in 6 weeks.
Wow, that's...
I was crazy for 6 weeks.
I bet. I mean, the sort of stroboscopic things that you're doing here, and it's one of the things that, I mean, obviously, that was my first introduction to your work, was through mm-hmm. that show at the Downtown Gallery, and I was just that piece really just stopped me dead in my tracks.
Thank you.
And I don't think I was alone in that. I mean, I was watching, the looks on everybody else's faces, and
I loved watching people watch it.
Yeah, I mean, and there's something. I mean, that piece. I've been thinking about it the past few weeks, and that whatever conceptual underpinnings there were, that that what that piece really, really with any art, you're trying to elicit like an honest reaction from people, and that the immediate reaction you have to that piece, it's so unsettling, seeing that kind of motion, and that's it's such a visceral thing. You can't really fake that, right? So it's something that really grabs you, just walking by, and invites you to spend time with it. Like, you can't look away almost. And I was thinking about how that piece sort of functions. Like, I mentioned, when we were talking before, that my impulse is always to sort of analyze how art functions and how it obtains those reactions, and then what then in turn what the function of that reaction is.
Okay. Yeah.
And with that particular piece, it really felt like, where you have this man under glass, a small man under glass, sort of wiggling around, almost like, he's in discomfort with everyone looking at him. And the way that it's presented underneath the sort of bell jar, like a 19th century specimen or something like that. And the first thing that you feel looking at it, the first thing that I feel looking at it is this, like I say, it's a very unsettling feeling. But the way that makes you sort of contemplate, like, without trying to get like too specific about like what does this mean or anything, but it makes you sort of think about a lot of different kinds of things about, like, how you might look at other people in general, or how different performative aspects of society might operate, or even about how scientific specimens and how we interact with those, how scientists interact with those, and how we all may not think about stuff like that. I mean, it invites you to move in a lot of different directions. And I'm not really sure if any of those were necessarily what you intended. Although at that, I'm not necessarily sure that that's super important.
Sure. Yeah, some of those things I hadn't quite thought of yet, which is great. It's relatively new, so I haven't really kicked it around a whole lot. But I like what you said. I was definitely going for something kind of uncanny, something where, despite the difference in scale, it was easy to relate to the figure. That's why I did it in the nude, so that it was just kind of more of a platonic form. Although it's a self-portrait, it's not got any kind of date or style associated with it. But yeah, I think maybe empathy is something I was going for. I don't really know. But I was definitely just trying to get, I think it was empathy. I was trying to get someone to picture being in that situation.
Yeah.
Frozen like that.
Yeah, and it's the kind of thing where I think it's operating on like a level that is really immediate, that sort of empathy, but you wouldn't necessarily be able to tease out exactly why you feel that way, or even exactly putting a name to what it is that you feel, but it's something that you understand innately.
I think it's from the motion.
Yeah. I
think it's from the fact that there's no really visible means of causing that motion, and so then it's animate. And then it's more like a living thing you can relate to.
Yeah. So then the other piece that you had there was also working with strobe lights, and then sort of rotating words that would align themselves in different combinations, and that you get different meanings as they combine through the different rotations. And now that I'm here in your studio looking around at the pieces that you have up on the wall, it seems like that is something that's kind of a theme with a lot of these pieces, where you are incorporating letter forms and words and language in these. These are mostly paintings, and that's not something that's a form that you traditionally think of as language oriented. Mm-hmm. But that the way that piece works, it's almost like a deconstruction of language itself.
That's fair. I like that, actually. I don't think I'd thought of it like that, but I like that. I don't know why I hadn't thought of it like that, because it was very much a structural approach to the whole thing. Like it was a 10-word sentence that I had written to someone. It was the entire email. I think that's important in terms of how it frames my emotional state. Mm-hmm. A 10-word sentence with only 6 different words in it, and so it's very easy to see the zigzag lines between all of them, to see each of these pairs and things like that. So yeah, it was pretty deconstructed, I guess. But more than that, it was an attempt to try to take that deconstruction and make it both really clean and abstract, but also very emotional at the same time. Like I think the form of the sentence, and then the presentation with the varying speeds, and the illusion of the strobe and the slowness, and the difference between the apparent speed and the actual speed, and the feeling of the air coming off of it and all that, was just meant to convey the kind of contained energy that was contained in the actual email, So it's really technical, and it's really clinical, and it's very science-based, but it's all in the service of like a small little Beckett theater of really torrid emotion.
Yeah.
And I like that contrast. And so it's the same, that kind of back and forth thing is a lot in the paintings. Like even when something's really legible, I often, not always, keep it kind of ambiguous or portentous or whatever you'd call it. And then other times it's just legible enough for you to know that there was a system here that made it, and hopefully to keep you interested either in figuring out the system or figuring out what the system was in the service of,
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And that's something that it seems like a lot of your work, that there's this complexity to it, and layering of meaning, where you are, it's on some level almost like you're making a puzzle that someone could solve, but that, and this was something that you said before, that there is this system is visible and apparent. You don't necessarily need to do that, but if you wanted to, you could. I don't think that that's something. I feel like there's something. It's something I think about with my own work a lot. That you want people to. You want to be able to make work that people will spend time with and come back to.
Right.
But I feel like that is a thing that's often very difficult. That people don't. The viewing public often will, especially at least with my medium, photography, you have a tendency for people to come to it and if it's a book, say, flip through it in 10 or 15 minutes and then it's on the shelf.
Right.
And even with something like paintings, where with a gallery exhibition, how long does one person necessarily stand in front of a piece? It's not necessarily that long. I mean, if someone stood for 15 whole minutes, that would probably be a long time.
That's a lifetime.
People. Yeah.
Yeah.
So you always want to figure out how to make something that invites people, that like kind of beckons people to make them want to spend more time with it. And the way that you're doing that here, it just seems really. I mean, I don't know if I want to. It's a word that gets overused, but it's kind of genius, you know.
I'll take it. This time, I guess. Yeah, I mean, it's you know, I think entertainment is a often overused word and kind of sometimes wrongly maligned word. You know, if something's entertaining, it's on your brain.
Mm-hmm.
You know, you can entertain thoughts and you can entertain, you know, actions, but if these paintings entertain or the sculptures entertain, then they're doing their job. They're getting someone to pay attention.
Mm-hmm.
You know?
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, and you know, I guess entertainment often has a connotation of being sort of shallow,
mm-hmm.
but it's really the quality of doing something engaging with someone's mind, providing an experience that they will value enough that they want to spend time with it. And I mean, that's really gives you the opportunity to do something by getting people to spend time with it. You have the opportunity to really provide layers
mm-hmm.
that they can dig through to whatever depth they choose.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's totally true. And I have to admit, like, I think a lot of that is because of the text.
Mm-hmm.
It's a hook.
Mm-hmm.
You know, like, in addition to keeping me occupied while I'm working and thinking in that very particular way about the marks and the meanings and everything, people would walk into my studio on open studio night here who tell me they don't look at art or don't know how to read paintings, and they'd be looking at my paintings really closely in spite of themselves.
Mm-hmm.
You know, like they'd get taken in by the forms because they already know kind of how to dissect them.
Mm-hmm.
You know, and so that's. I'm moving away from text because I have other things at the moment that are kind of interesting me, but I'm not sad about that because I'd hate for it to become a crutch.
Yeah, that's true. I mean that's it's one thing about the art making process is once something becomes too well understood for yourself, it loses sort of the interest and edge.
That really might be it. Yeah,
you always want that sort of feeling of friction when
mm-hmm.
you're making it, where it's not too easy. You don't want it to be too hard either, but like if things are too smooth, then they, you know, you can't. There's nothing to grab you. It just slides right off.
Right.
But I think, I mean, you know, when I'm thinking about this, you know, like I was saying to you before, that there's you know, I always sort of take a little while to sort of get anywhere. And, you know, one of the great things about being able to do a podcast like this is that it gives me the opportunity to see lots of different kinds of work, but also in talking to people to sort of like on the fly work through what it is that I'm getting out of the work.
Yeah.
And you know, when I'm thinking about, you know, you say, when you're pointing out, you know, that people understand text and letter forms already, and I think that's true. There's one of the things that's making me think, though, is that, you know, when I don't know if this is too facile a comparison, but like the thing that's coming to mind is, you know, that that famous Magritte painting of the pipe.
Mm-hmm.
That I can never, for some reason, remember the actual title of. I
think is it The Treachery of Images?
Yeah.
Something like that.
Yeah. Where there's a thing about, you know, the image makes you that we're so cultivated to understand images as being as representative that
mm-hmm.
that the metaphor, it loses its status as a metaphor, and you just understand it as the thing itself, even though it's not.
Mm-hmm.
And it almost seems like, you know, that language has that capacity as well, and where that the thing that you're doing here is actually putting color onto a canvas, but when people come in and look at it immediately, that's not necessarily how they're going to understand it.
Mm-hmm.
That's it's making little it's making my brain light up right now, you know.
That's the name of the game. Right.
But I mean, yeah, I spend a lot of time thinking about how, you know, how different art forms and different techniques function, and what, you know, as my own sort of repertoire as an artist is fairly narrow in terms of what techniques I can execute well. So I spend a lot of time thinking about what it is that, as a photographer, what photography does well and what doesn't it do well, and how I can sort of, you know, engage with those limitations.
Mm-hmm.
And thinking about that in terms of like what you're doing here, that this you know medium, this you know art form of painting, that, you know, putting paint on a canvas is not necessarily something that I don't think most people would immediately think to incorporate text in layers that way, but it winds up being a really appropriate medium for that execution, I guess. I don't know if I'm talking out of my butt right now, but
for what execution? For a use of language, or like abstract painting as a means of getting literal ideas across, or what do you
kind of all of that, like because like some of these things, like this painting that's behind your shoulder here, the one with the lines on it,
mm-hmm.
It really there's a lot of different layers here of what you can do. When you were telling me about it, that, you know, it works as a code if you want to spend that much that kind of time on it.
Mm-hmm.
And codes themselves are just a different way of encoding of you know, putting meaning into a certain form,
mm-hmm.
of embodying meaning in a particular way. Language itself is that as well.
Right.
So, but then also, you know, color and line and form. These are also ways of encoding information, and they don't necessarily have anything to do with each other. So the way that you're putting all of these different layers of information, and how information is depicted, and or how it's transmitted, you know,
mm-hmm.
There's, like I said, there's a friction to that, you know. And it's not necessarily something that's obvious that you would be able to do as well in any other format, you know.
I see. Yeah. I mean, it's an arena in which I can play with the words and the ideas and colors, and somehow they don't come out a big pile of brown.
Right.
Yeah, that makes sense. That's a good way to think about it, I think.
Am I talking too much here?
No,
I always get a little worried about, like, if I'm explaining someone's work to them, you know, like there's a certain arrogance to the sort of critical analytical mindset.
I love hearing people. I mean, you might really know more about how that painting works than I do, because as you were talking, I was thinking about it, and I don't really know how the color or color choice relates to any bit of the content.
Mm-hmm.
I kind of decided that right off the bat. I was just winging it, like I was putting all this time into the structure, and you know, like I had 34 colors to work with, and I wanted them to be spray paint, so that kind of chose my palette for me. And that's the thing I do a lot, actually, is kind of like intentionally in painting they call it buckeye. Mm-hmm. Buckeye color is color right from the tube. I don't know why they call it that, but that's what my old teacher called it. And so like that's that drawing is all a particular set of pens, and if you were a pen historian, you could tell me, you could know what pens made that, or like these colors, like if you were a spray paint historian, you'd know how that got put together. But I, so structurally, I think that's interesting to me to color things that way. But what I was saying is it's confusing to me because I just kind of decided to go for it and to put all this work and some of the emotion into this system just to kind of see how the system comes out, And so the painting, to me, is still kind of confusing.
Yeah. I mean, that's something that I really sometimes have a hard time getting my head around, how other people work, that I find this is something that's very common to a lot of photographers, tend to be very, very concerned with being able to control what it is that the piece is, exactly what it is, It's always, there's this thing, like my high school English teacher was telling me once, that he had this lecture that he was giving us about poetry and how poetry works, and that that when you talk to different kinds of writers, that a writer that's a prose writer will say, "This is my prose. This is what my prose means. This is like, and that's all. That's all. Like I made it this way, and this is what it does." And I don't think that's like completely true. I'm sure there are a lot of prose writers who aren't like that. But that his point was like, with a poet, a poet is going to say, well, what do you think it means? And I find that, I don't know, I'm sort of trying to work on a theory of what kinds of people gravitate towards different art forms,
Yeah. I think that thing about control is, at least in photography, it's because it's a purely mechanical thing, right? You actually can control every single aspect of your photograph if you want.
Yeah.
And so, I mean...
Depending on the genre, yeah.
Sure. Yeah, a studio photograph, yeah, of course. And so someone who wants to control every single aspect of a production might veer towards photography instead of painting, right? So that it might just be kind of a self-selecting group of people who appreciate that kind of control, right?
Yeah.
Maybe. Some of them for sure.
Definitely. I can think of one or two. No, but I mean, this sort of this idea of like, I mean, even somebody like me, where I don't construct my images, they're all sort of just things that I observe, things that I find, scenarios, and I typically don't, stage things or move things much, if at all. They're pretty much as found. But even at that, there's a certain, once I see the thing, like I will have a sort of moment of like, oh, that's the thing, and then work the scene in order to arrive at the thing that this like emotion that I'm trying to capture. Where, and in that sense, like photography is a real sort of like almost subtractive art form, where you're trying to you see a thing and then you're trying to remove everything that isn't that thing.
Okay.
Where
I like that.
With painting,
I like that.
You're starting with something completely blank, and you're adding. It's more additive. But it seems like in that approach, you don't necessarily like that. It's the mechanics of it sort of invite you to invite variation and chance into it a little more, or at least something unexpected. I mean, for you, do you like how much do you sort of play with, like, because these pieces, like, there's definitely layers to it where they're very meticulous, they're very meticulously planned, but there's also a certain chaoticness to how the paint actually is on the canvas as well. So I'm just kind of curious, like how that interplay between control and chance sort of works in your practice.
Kind of, I mean, it's something I'm aware of. Yeah, like that drawing, like, it looks like a computer did it because it's very mathematically structured, and I appreciate that. And like, I mean, I enjoy that. I don't know what I mean by appreciate, but But like this one we were just talking about with the spray paint, like the composition is all extremely controlled, but like personality still comes through. Like if you look, like if you pay attention to this gray, this slate blue, it drips a lot more than other colors do. Consistently throughout all the different times it appears in the painting and that kind of thing, you know. And so, you know, and like that one, like in that upper left, there's a particular purple that has faded quite a lot, which is really disappointing. So like even in the structure, you know, a little bit of mechanical or chemical or whatever personality comes through. But you know, I definitely wanted this mark to be like that, but I couldn't have told you exactly how it happened. But yeah, it's something I play with a lot, and a lot of these things are more constructed than they seem. Like we didn't talk about that one, but there's actually in that faint yellow in there, there's a lot of detail. There's letters that were masking off part of that yellow that you could read if you wanted to, but it's very for once, I was not trying to hit you over the head with the structure of it.
I mean, and that's another thing too that I find that you know, as I talk to more people, that there's a lot of that thing that the technique involved is often surprising. You know, the amount of like how meticulous something can be in the execution of it, not necessarily being apparent in the final form of it, but then that's also part of the planning of it. It's really, I mean, it's the kind of thing that it just it's so different from how I work that it's like it really always kind of puts a smile on my face thinking about stuff like that, you know. I mean, so yeah, like a lot of the you have a lot of different things here, and both in medium and like emotional content as well. Some of these pieces seem like, and like some of the sketches you were showing me seem very playful, and some of them seem I'm trying to think of what the right word is. Like there's a sort of tougher edge to them, you know.
Like a harder, like a sharper definition of form, or you mean of content?
I mean, like emotionally, what you immediately feel looking at like some of the, like especially in those sketches you were showing me, which unfortunately I don't think the listeners are going to be able to see, but
these are on my website, or
are they?
My soon to be revamped and completely not dysfunctional website. Yeah.
I mean, like a lot. There's like some of the styles of sketches that in that book. There's
self-portraits, I guess we should mention.
Yes, there's
just
self-portraits.
You can picture it a little bit.
Yeah, they're self-portraits, but they're each in a sort of, they're in varying styles, and some of them, you know, feel very carefree and almost like childlike in some of them, you know. Whereas some of the things that in some of these other paintings, and I'm not sure exactly how, but just that they feel more. You know, that they have more of a you know, the opposite of that. What would the opposite of that be? Like maturity, heaviness? I'm not sure
Focus,
exactly. Yeah.
Or calm, or care. Yeah.
And not even in the execution exactly. Like not in the strokes, the brush strokes or anything. Just like you know, even, and maybe it just has to do with the color palette. Like, you know, like this one here, like the fact that it is literally dark, for at least the bottom half of it, you know, just it operates in a different emotional stratum.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, I mean, I realize sometimes, like, I don't think I was aware when I started the weekly self-portraits that they would be descriptive of my mood,
Mm-hmm.
but by definition it was, you know. And I think it's probably true of everyone's work to some extent or another, like, because it's true of life, right? Like, the day you're having influences how you talk to people or cut your steak or whatever, but yeah, like, as much as I try to be very careful about where autobiography comes into this stuff, like, that was a painting made at a very dark time in my life, you know? So it sneaks in spite of you, you know?
Yeah. But, so here's an interesting question, or interesting to me anyway, is that, you know, when you're working on a painting, like, the longest it ever takes me to work on a single photograph might be, like, a day. Like, and if it takes me a whole day to work on a photograph, it's because, like, I was really working the shit out of that photograph. But, like, being able to complete a painting in one day, it's just, like, that's not going to happen for most paintings. So, like, do you find that when you are, like you say, your emotional arc through, you know, even through the course of one day, but definitely over the course of many days or weeks, however long it takes you to finish a painting, do you find that, like, how does that affect how you're working, or how does it affect? Do you think that arc winds up in the final form of the piece, or is it?
I think it has to. That's what I was saying. Like, I think, yeah, I don't know. I think it's also one of those things that I think as the person in charge of this stuff, I reserve the right to wash my hands of. You know, there's a certain amount of chance. There's a certain element of chance in each of these things we're looking at the moment, and I would like to think that's what I'm responding to as much as anything else. Like this, that, and maybe this all started because they were laid on the ground under another painting just to catch drips and for me to blot stencils and all this stuff. And so some of it's just responding to a form that was, like, literally chance, you know, and gravity. I don't know. Maybe I'm just being cagey.
I mean, you know, I can relate to that. It's always kind of weird talking about your own work, but you know, I mean, your work has so much energy to it. I mean, it's just like looking around this room. There's just, like, it just seems like, like it just seems like you must have a ton of energy, just because, I mean, just not only in the individual pieces, you know, there's a certain I can't think of the right word. It's not like, I mean, there's a certain freneticness to it, I guess, but
I'll take that.
But
sure.
Also, like, in the diversity of media, you know, that, like, it seems like you're going in a lot of different directions. And you know, for one person to be able to contain all of that seems like difficult.
I mean, it's my hobby too. Like, I was taking a walk, like, yesterday, trying to think of what to talk to you about. I was like, well, I don't really want to talk about camping or just reading books, and I didn't really have a whole lot of else that takes up my time, you know, besides, like, being with my fiance and friends. Like, if I'm alone, this is probably what I'm doing. And so that's really, that's easy. That makes it easy to get a lot out, you know, and it's not nearly as much as I'd like.
Yeah.
Not by any stretch.
Well, I think, like, I mean, I feel like that's a pretty common thing for artists, is you're always kind of hungry, you know, and when you're not feeling that urgency to do it anymore, that's when the work starts to suffer.
Right.
Do you find that when you typically work sort of in modes for, like, at a stretch, or is it more like, I'm going to do painting for a little bit, or I'm going to, like, take apart projectors and for a little bit, or like,
it's a little bit like that. Yeah. In part because the studio I had before was a different configuration, and it wasn't very conducive to the amount of real estate that paintings like this kind of need.
Mm-hmm.
Each of these paintings is probably a year and a half old at the youngest, and so the painting just kind of, I put it on pause just because my studio, I couldn't deal with it.
Mm-hmm.
And now, yeah, I mean, the trouble is I have a lot of different projects I'd like to pursue, and like this whole new idea came up in my sketchbooks that I would put everything on pause for just to focus on, but I also have things I've invested so many hours and dollars in that I want to see them through. But I always come back to painting.
Yeah.
Actually, yeah. Like paintings, if not a constant, it's a recurring part of my practice, for sure.
Yeah. Yeah. I find that I tend to sort of be really in one sort of mode of working. Like I can't, like whatever it is that I'm doing, like it just, that's my full attention. And like I always feel like I should be doing something else. Like that other thing that I was doing before, I should be doing that at the same time, but it's really hard for me to switch gears, But do you don't?
I think it's really healthy to switch gears.
Yeah.
I mean, I think most painters would tell you that if you have one canvas, if you have 3 canvases in progress at a time, you'll finish and get more out of each of those 3 than you would out of one at a time. Just because you can take what you learned from this one or what you're sick of about this one and deal with it over here, and vice versa. So your iterative process is really much faster. And by extension, I think it's the same for me with like the hammering thing is like a Zen thing that is always there, and I can go to it when I want, and then I can bounce around to these other modes when I need to.
Yeah, we didn't even talk about the hammering thing. That this you have this. What is that substrate made out of?
The thickest cold pressed watercolor paper I could find.
Yeah, so it's
400 pounds,
and it's like torn edges, and then you take these letter stamps.
Yeah,
and
steel stamps.
Yeah, and then you're making rows of letters. It's very regular, but then you don't fill it with any kind of ink or anything. So it's just the impression on the page. And the one that you have there, you were saying was a list of different injuries you've had over your life. I mean, you want to talk about like a certain dark edge to it. I mean, that's
yeah, I guess. That's interesting, dark, but it's just light on paper.
Yeah.
Yeah, and see, even there, like, I try to, I don't think, I mean, conceptually or formally, I don't think that would be nearly as interesting if it were, like, ink on paper. If it were much more legible.
Right.
Or if it weren't, besides legibility, if it weren't even just a bit of a challenge to kind of read it because of the way it looks, then I think it wouldn't be as interesting.
Yeah, well, no, definitely not. And I mean, there's like it. To me, anyway, I mean, it seems like it operates in a lot of different levels. Where the fact that it's hard to read makes you. It's almost like a certain like archaeological. Aspect to it, where you're trying to decipher something, and these are experiences from your past, but then the fact that they're marks on a surface, and you were describing the process of inscribing those marks as having a certain violence, and then that violence is reflected in the text itself. Those marks also, I mean, they bring to mind things, scars as well. I mean, there's, and then the way that those fade, and they're only visible when the light is coming, or not necessarily only visible, more visible when the light is coming from a different direction.
They're really only visible when they're lit like that.
Yeah.
I've had people standing this close, and I've pointed at it, mentioned something about it, and they look, and I see on their face, they look at a blank piece of paper and they furrow their brows a tiny bit, if at all, and then look away.
Mm-hmm.
It's invisible, which I think is so
Yeah.
fascinating.
It's really interesting.
It's weird.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, there's something about all of these pieces that are really, like I said, it really just invites you to spend time with it, where there's a sort of a surface level, something that immediately arrests your attention, but that by spending time with it, really enriches the experience. I feel like, art, it's one of those things, I feel like everybody does, where they try to define what art is, come up with a definition of art, at least, at some point when you're in school, maybe.
Right. It's an academic question.
Yeah. But like I the way I tend to think of it is that art is, it's a crafted experience. It's like an experience that the artist wants you to have. And
that's a good definition. Yeah.
And
I don't have a definition. That's a good one. I might take it. Sorry, go on.
But I mean that there's a certain kind of thing, like, there are lots of different kinds of experiences that you can have, and some people will complain about having to look at stuff that feels like work, but which, I mean, I kind of roll my eyes at that, but there's a kind of experience that you cannot have quickly, and
right,
yeah, and but your work feels like it invites multiple types of experience. I mean, it's fascinating. I always ask my guests to bring a topic of their own, something that they want to talk about. And the topic that you picked was art education?
Yeah, I think, for want of something a little less polemical, yeah. The other thing I was thinking about is just the idea of studio practice, but like I said in the email, I didn't want it to just be a long conversation about my work.
I think that there's a lot of,
but they're related.
I could have a lot of, just an hour-long conversation about, more than an hour-long conversation about just your work, but art education, so what are you thinking?
So yeah, since I wrote you, I've been thinking about this a lot. Like, I was really lucky to go to the high school and to the college that I went to. My high school was only a couple of years old. It was a magnet school for the whole county. It was an art and technology focused, Baltimore County.
Okay.
Art and technology focused thing with majors like dance and theater and music and visual art and literary art and cosmetology, carpentry, electricity, everything. Really great place. And part of what made it so great was that everyone spent a significant amount of time doing things that they really loved. Mm-hmm. That just accelerated everyone's learning in that subject or those subjects immensely, I think. And then I went to Cooper Union, which was a real privilege, because the nature of that school meant you had some real world-class faculty, because they knew they'd be getting really focused students and few of them, So it was I've had as good an art education, as good an academic art education as you could get. So I hope it doesn't sound like I'm bragging, but it's my perspective. I was lucky. And so to think about a school experience without art, which I think is increasingly common, is just devastating to me.
Yeah.
Like, it's at least like one good thing about No Child Left Behind is that everyone is kind of talking about this stuff, and teaching to the test is kind of culturally becoming like a bad word, right? So that's a good way that it's kind of influencing the conversation by a negative example. But just to think of a model of education that's based more on repetition. This is the analogy I came up with in the shower today. to, the model based on retention and repetition and stuff treats the kid's brain like a sieve, right? Like a filter. You judge it by what sticks, in a certain way. And I can't for the life of me I can't understand that when I think the smart money is on looking at the brain as a factory.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that idea is gaining some currency, especially, you look at High Tech High here in San Diego, and project-based learning is a general kind of concept that's being explored right now, and for how long, I don't know. I mean, how long it has been a thing, I really don't know. But like all that design thinking stuff is really good and it's really productive, but it's still not quite, it doesn't function the same way art does, in that an art critique is the closest you can get to having the student bring 100% of a topic to the table,
mm-hmm.
And I think that's, I mean, it's an entire aspect of like cognitive development and critical thinking that's hard to monetize, and so it's cut out of schools. You know? And besides, like, the engagement of a student with material that he really cares about, because that could be social studies or history for another student, whatever. To have to create the thing yourself, like the very meaning and form of it yourself, and then to have to debate it with your peers is just, I mean, that's a phenomenal way to learn how to be articulate and to articulate weird, abstract shit.
Mm-hmm.
That's, it's been a long time since I've been in high school, but I don't know where else you do that in school.
Yeah. I mean, it's an interesting, I mean, like, obviously education is a super hot topic right now. My wife was a teacher for several years, an elementary school teacher, and like a lot of her friends still are elementary school teachers, and so like education is a topic that I it comes up in conversation a lot when we're at
Mm-hmm.
hangouts or
in
whatever.
my circles too. Yeah.
It's interesting, thinking about how to your point, the No Child Left Behind teaching to the test thing definitely stresses a certain approach that doesn't really reward critical thinking or concept-based learning. And right now, the whole thing that everyone is talking about is actually the Common Core,
Mm-hmm.
which has its proponents and its antagonists. But one of the things about that, the more current modern day approach to educational philosophy has to do, it's whatever else you can say about the Common Core approach, that at least philosophically it is trying to take more of this sort of critical thinking,
Mm-hmm.
conceptual learning kind of thing, where you're building solid foundations instead of just teaching people procedures. And there's something valuable about that, but
Sure.
even at that, it's still really focused on the whole educational debate that no one really seen, or at least in government, nobody really is focusing on. What people are talking about is STEM subjects, right? Science, technology, engineering, math.
Leaving aside that STEAM is such a sexier word if you include the A for art. Like, that's motive power. Like, literally, STEAM's so much better.
Yeah, it really is. And I mean, it's something, like I mentioned to you, I'm an engineer for my day job. So, I mean, clearly I have a strong background in those subjects. It's really, when I think to myself about the experiences that I had in school that were the most valuable on a personal level, even though, math and science and technology is something that I'm good at, the things that were the most meaningful to me were music. And, I was involved in theater when I was in high school and in college. And all of those things really, they provide a lot of benefits to people that are, like you say, hard to monetize, and even really hard to get your hands around, like to articulate exactly what it is that they offer you.
Mm-hmm.
So people will say, when they're having these discussions, they'll say that that means that they're not, like, that the intangibles are inherently less important. I don't know. I mean, on some level, it does seem like having some focus on math and science achievement is a laudable goal, but it does seem like there's something very missing from that. And even when I think about the engineering education that I had, a lot of it was a lot more focused. Like the school that I went to was, I mean, if you want to talk about people bragging, like I went to a pretty elite engineering school, and one of the reasons why the school I went to is so highly regarded is because it has a very interdisciplinary focus, and it has, or at least at the time that I went there, it had the broadest arts, social studies, and humanities requirements of any other technology-based school.
Cool.
The downside of that is that you tended not to get very much depth in any one, humanities subject. But I mean, that's definitely something that you can see. Like the kids that come out of that school tend to be pretty highly regarded once they enter industry. So there's definitely something about that, having that interdisciplinary approach, that is really valuable, even just in a monetizable way.
Yeah, and I think people are, I'm reading opinion pieces and magazine articles and stuff more and more about that, but it's just glacially slow to see any kind of policy in any level, state or local or whatever, catch up to the thinking. Like I think any business owner would tell you he wants a well-rounded, creative person, who's going to think outside of the leader's own box. Like that's natural, but it's still kind of a hard sell.
Yeah, I think one of the things that that gets lost in a more what people think of as a science and technology based approach is that science and technology, science in particular, is intended to answer big questions, but the practice of science and the practice of technology are really like laser focused on really specific things. And I find I'm involved with like, because I've been at the company I work at a long time, I'm a fairly senior engineer there now. So it means when we're going to hire people, I'm involved with that process of interviewing people. And one of the things that I find is that a lot of the kids that are coming straight out of school are really bad at seeing whole systems, seeing whole big picture things, and like that's what we're always looking for, right? And I do sort of wonder if this sort of laser focus on pedagogical focus on just those skills is what leads to people not being able to be as useful at seeing systems.
Right.
I mean, and that's getting away from even just the things that people traditionally say about arts education, that it just sort of in some nebulous way that being well-rounded is good for you, or that
that art makes you happy.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. That's really facile. I think. Like it's more about, I had 8 years of critiques every week or more often, having to like take weird data like this and interpret it, in ways that weren't in any book. Like it's such a skill, and it's not just that art is pretty,
right,
by any means.
Right. And the thing that you were saying before about art being a means of producing knowledge, that and important in a political way. When you talk about what the purpose of education is. And a lot of people will say that, at least in this country and often in the UK as well, I hear this critique as well, that our educational systems are really founded on, creating a good labor force, a useful labor force, which to what extent it actually does that is questionable. But if you're talking about creating an engaged citizenry, that, one of the things that art, like even if you're not producing art yourself, that it's really through artistic endeavors and historical artistic endeavors, certainly, that these are the things that are really investigating and questioning aspects of society that need to be investigated. Mm-hmm. And science doesn't do that, really. Engineering doesn't do that at all. In fact, you could say a lot of the criticism that people have of the Silicon Valley tech culture is that it is technology divorced from any kind of real social awareness. Mm-hmm. And so they have this idea of disrupting cultures without having any understanding of how that actually affects the people that are being affected. Technology without a conscience. And art education is, having access to this giant body of historical work and contemporary work commenting on society is, it's a massively useful thing in having a population that is engaged with those issues and willing to look at them in many different ways.
It's the diversity that I think is really important.
Yeah.
Like the other thing, like on this topic, that when I think about this, I always end up in the same few places, and one of those places is like the idea of art as small business. Mm-hmm. As an economic factor, as a component of a local economy. I think, for instance, like I would like to be a small business. I would like to employ people not to work at Walmart. Mm-hmm. When everyone works at Walmart, we're fucked. Mm-hmm. And so, like those sculptures you saw at downtown, like I spent money at 24 different local places, local and national, whatever, but like I spread that money around. It's created a thing that wasn't there before, mm-hmm. for which there may or may not be a market, but it's a diversification of money and labor and time, and so I think the more people who can work in idiosyncratic kind of ways, mm-hmm. productively, that's got to be better, like in like a biodiversity kind of sense.
Yeah. Yeah. Our current political climate isn't really set up to value things like that.
Right.
It's really striking to me how the political narrative, like that's just sort of accepted by everybody, left and right, at least in this country, really, like people don't, there is pushback against this idea to some degree, but it's really, like our system is really set up in a way to maximize shareholder value.
Right.
And even though people on, liberal, progressive people will push back against that idea, it's not, they're not, there's still a fair amount of buy-in to that, it seems like. That having a diverse ecosystem is, whatever that means, whether it's intellectually or economically or, whatever, artistically, that's not something that seems to be valued. Like, mm-hmm. Even though things are very polarized right now, it really seems like in the main, different groups are often working towards the goal of a monoculture, just their monoculture. Mm-hmm. That's yeah. Oh, I don't know, man.
Nope, I don't know either.
Well, I guess it's not. I remember I saw a lecture. There was a photographer named Matt Black. I don't know if you've ever heard of him. He does this sort of, he does a lot of sort of artistic photojournalism, and his focus is on, lately has been on the impact of the California drought on agricultural communities, and I remember, so I saw this lecture that he gave, and I asked him at one point during the Q&A if he thought that these problems were even solvable, and his answer was that's not my job.
Yeah.
Which is kind of flip, I guess, but like on some level, like, you know, it at the very least, just asking the questions and pointing out the issues is on some level enough, like, especially since not that many people...
It's more than nothing.
Yeah, and especially because not that many people are doing it.
Right.
Yeah. Well, I don't know, maybe that seems like a good place to wrap up, but hey, I really appreciate you taking the time to talk to me.
Of course, Mike. Yeah, this was my pleasure.
All right, so that was my conversation with TML Dunn. I definitely encourage you to check out his website, and, you know, if you ever get the chance to see his work in person, it's an experience. I highly recommend it. Also, I'd like to thank him for being so patient with me, talking so much during our conversation. He was a really good sport about that. I'm going to try to do better in the future. In any case, if you've got any thoughts about the conversation or anything, please drop me a line at podcast@keepthechannelopen.com. You can also find me and the show on Twitter @ChannelOpenPod, or on Facebook at facebook.com/keepthechanneleopen. If you like what we're doing here, please subscribe and leave a review on iTunes. Our theme music is by Poddington Bear. You can find more of his music available for licensing at soundofpicture.com. Next week, our guest will be photographer Claire A. Warden. That's a good one, so you can look forward to that. And until then, remember, keep the channel open.